Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 7 and in this video we will explain Chapter 5 about the hypothesis in quantitative research. And at first, let me introduce myself. My name is Sekat Hidayati and let's get started the material. After studying the research question and examining the literature, the quantitative researcher is ready to state a hypothesis based on the question. The hypothesis presents the researcher's expectation about the relationship between variables within the question. The following are additional examples of hypotheses in educational research. At first, boys in elementary school achieve at a higher level in single-sex classes than in mixed classes. And the second, students who complete a unit of problem-solving strategies will score higher on a standardized mathematics test than those who have completed a control unit. And 3. Middle school students who have previously taken music lessons will have higher math aptitudes. And 4. Middle school students who have siblings will be more popular about their peers than students who do not have siblings. And 5. Students who have warm-up exercise before an examination will score higher on that examination than those who do not. And last, elementary school children who do not get aptitude sleep will perform at a lower level academically than will their peers who have adequate sleeps. And the next is two reasons for studying a hypothesis. Two reasons for studying hypothesis before the data gathering phase of a quantitative study are: the first is a well-grounded hypothesis indicates that the researcher has sufficient knowledge in the area to undertake the investigation. And the second, the hypothesis gives direction to the collection and interpretation of the data. Next, purposes of the hypothesis is in quantitative research. Principal purposes served by the hypothesis including the following. At first, the hypothesis brings together information to enable the researcher to make a tentative statement about how the variables in the study may be related. And second, because hypotheses propose tentative explanation for phenomena, they simulate a researcher endeavor that result the accumulation of the knowledge. And the third, the hypothesis provides the investigator with a relational statement that is directly testable in research study. And the fourth, the hypothesis provides direction to the research. And the last, the hypothesis provides a framework for reporting the findings and conclusion of the study. Okay, and then the next material will be explained by Evi Fitriani.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Evi Fitriani, and now I want to continue material from Sekar Filza. Okay, the first is suggestion from verifying hypothesis. Induction and deduction are complementary process. In induction, one starts with specific observation and research general conclusion. In deduction, one begins with generalization and makes specific prediction. Okay, the next is verifying hypothesis inductively. The inductive procedure is a particularly fruitful start of hypothesis for classroom teacher. In the inductive process, the researchers make observation, think about the problem, turn to the literature for clues, make additional observation, and then formulate a hypothesis, then seek to account for the observed behavior. The researchers or teacher then test the hypothesis under control condition to examine scientifically the assumption concerning the relationship between the specific variable. The following are addition for example of hypotheses that might be arrived the inductively from a teacher's observation. The first is student learning of computer programming in the middle grade increase their development of logical thinking skills. The second, enhancing high school student learning from computer assistant teaching in chemistry. The third, students who are trying to write lecture summaries perform better than students who simply take notes. The fourth, children score higher on final measure of first grade reading achievement when they are taught in small group rather than large group. The five, the cognitive and affective development of first grade children is influenced by the amount of prior preschool experience. And the last, after-school tutoring programs increase the achievement of RX students. The next is verifying hypotheses deductively. These hypotheses have the advantage of leading to a more general system of knowledge because the framework for incorporating the meaningful into the body of knowledge already exists within the theory. A hypothesis derived from a theory is known as a deductive hypothesis. After choosing a theory of interest, you use deductive reasoning to arrive at the logical consequence of the theory. Another useful theory from which an educational researchers might make deduction is Piaget's classic theory on the development of logical thinking in the children. Piaget, at 1968, suggests that children pass through various stages in their mental development, including the state of constraint operation, which began at age 7 or 8 years and marks the transition from dependence of perception to an ability to use some logical operation. Piaget's cognitive theory also emphasizes that learning is a highly active process in which learner must construct knowledge. Thanks for me, and the next material will be explained by Dinda Aribatul.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Dinda Aribatul Fatimah Amjad. I will explain about characteristic of a usable hypothesis. After planning for a hypothesis, but before trying any real experimental experiments, you must evaluate the hypothesis. A hypothesis is that the expected relationship between variables. A hypothesis must conjecture the relationship between two or more variables. It would not be cost effective to say the car will not start and it has a wiring system, because no relationship between the variable is specific, and therefore there is no proposed relationship to test. B. A hypothesis must be testable. If the hypothesis is on target, some predictable result will be displayed. A testable hypothesis allows the researcher to determine by observing and collecting data whether the implied inferred consequence actually occur. Otherwise, it will not be possible to confirm the hypothesis. In the previous example, the failure to start the car is a penalty for machine hypothesis is clearly unstated in this word. If the means to measure variables are not available, no one will be able to collect the data needed to validate a hypothesis, unless you can specifically define the metrics of each variable and then can measure them. you cannot test your hypothesis. The indices of the variables are known as the activity definition. Recall from chapter 2 that variables are operationally defined by specifying the step the investigator takes to measure that variable. The operational definition of taking the test would be scored from a scale that measures how well a student is doing for the various tests that make up the test. You can define self-esteem as a score achieved on a child's self-image profile, and reading performance as a score on the California Reading Test, or as a first grade teacher's rating for success. Area reading ensures that variables can be given operational definition. Avoid using structure where it would be difficult or impossible to find suitable measure. Structure such as creativity, authoritarianism, and democracy have had so diverse meanings that it will be difficult, if not impossible, to reach consensus on the operational definition of those concepts. Remember that variables must be clearly defined in terms of identifiable and observable behavior. C. A hypothesis should be consistent with the existing body of knowledge. Hypothesis should not contradict previously established knowledge. The hypothesis my car will not start because the fluid in the battery has changed to gold meets the first two criteria, but it is so contrary to what is known about the nature of matter that you would not follow. The hypothesis the car will not start because the liquid in the battery has evaporated to a low level correspond to previous knowledge, and therefore it is worth watching. This again emphasizes the need for a thorough review of the literature in order to formulate hypotheses based on previous research in this area. And the last D, a hypothesis should be stated as simply and concisely as possible. Remember that the goals of testability and clarity will be best served by more specific assumption. When do hypotheses have the same explanatory power? Prefer the simpler one, as it will provide the necessary explanation with fewer hypotheses and variables to define. Remember that this principle of parsimony is important in evaluating hypotheses.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Octavian Bugar, and in this video I want to continue the material, and the material is the types of hypotheses. There are three categories of hypotheses: research, null, and alternate. And I will explain the research hypothesis. The research hypothesis, the hypotheses we have discussed this far are called research hypotheses. They are the hypotheses developed from observation, the related literature, and or the theory described in the study. A research hypothesis states the relationship one expects to find as a result of the research. It may be a statement about the expected relationship of the expected difference between the variable in the study. The next is the null hypothesis. It's called the null hypothesis because it states that there is no relationship between the variables in the population. A null hypothesis states a negotiation. This means not the reverse of what the experimenter expects or predicts. Now is the alternative hypothesis. Note that the hypothesis children taught by individual instruction will exhibit less mastery of mathematical concepts than those taught by group instruction. Besides, a relationship between variables and therefore is not a null hypothesis. It's an example of an alternative hypothesis. The retention of a null hypothesis is not positive evidence that the null hypothesis is true. It indicates that the evidence is insufficient and that the null hypothesis, the research hypothesis, and the alternative hypothesis are all possible. Next slide. Now the testing hypothesis. Hypothesis testing involves the following step. Step 1. State in operational terms the relationship that should be observed if the research hypothesis is true. Step 2. State the null hypothesis. Step 3. Select a research method that will enable the hypothesis relationship to be observed if it's there. 4. Gather the empirical data and select and calculate appropriate descriptive statistics for this data. 5. Calculate inferential statistics to determine the probability that your obtained result could have occurred by chance when the null hypothesis is true. 6. If the probability of the observed finding being due to chance is very small, one will have sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Next slide. Classroom example of testing a hypothesis. A teacher is interested in investigating reinforcement theory in the classroom. From her understanding of reinforcement theory, this teacher hypothesizes that teacher's positive comment students' paper will lead to greater achievement. Step 1. The deduced implication is that as follows. Teachers' positive comments on students' paper during a specific unit will result in higher scores of the end of unit test for the students. Compare with students who receive no comments. It's the relationship between the two variable teachers' positive comments and pupil performance on the end of unit tests that will be investigated. Step 2. For statistical testing, the research hypothesis must be transformed into a null hypothesis. The population mean achievement score for students receiving positive comments, this mean experimental group, will be the same as the population mean achievement score for the student receiving no comments. This is the control group. Step 3. After getting permission from parents or guardian for the children to participate, the teacher will select students to be randomly assigned to the experimental and control groups. For the student in the experimental group, she will write positive comment on their papers, whereas the student assigned to the control group receive no comment. Step 4. After completing the specific unit, the teacher will administer a common end of unit test to both groups and derive average mean achievement scores of the test for each group. Next. Step 5. Inferential statistics can then be used to indicate whether any difference in mean achievement score is real or is likely to be merely a function of a chance. If the difference is not likely to be a function of chance, the researcher tentatively concludes that it results from the different treatment given to the two groups. Next. the quantitative research plan. A research plan should include the following elements: the problem, the hypothesis, the research methodology, and proposed data analysis. The following list briefly describe each component. Number 1 is problem. The plan begins with a clear statement of the search problem. Number 2, hypothesis. A quantitative question is followed by a concise statement of the research hypothesis. Number 3, methodology. This section explains how you will conduct the study. Number 4, data analysis. Indicate how you will analyze the data to test the hypothesis and or answer the research question. Next slide. Okay, thank you. That's our material. Thanks for watching this video. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.